Russian forces continue their offensive operations along the second line of defense in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, advancing along the Vovcha river line in the northern direction to align the front line with the river line, gaining control over additional positions to the northwest of Oleksivka again against the river line, and gaining control over Hai as well as some fortifications on the northern bank of the Yanchur River towards the highway connecting Pokrovsk in the north down to Hulyai in the south. The Russian advances in the area are centered around solidifying their control over the northern flank of the second line of defense. By advancing along the Vovcha river line, the Russian forces create a buffer zone between their positions along the defensive line and the Ukrainian positions. This is due to the fact that the Russians are looking to advance beyond the current positions to gain full control over the second and first lines of defense here in the Zaporizhzhia region. If they advance further westwards without securing the northern flank, the Ukrainians can counterattack as they did near Sqkm, Oleksandrorad, and Sqkm to regain control over the supply lines leading up to the front line. Cutting off the supplies leading to the front line will encircle the Russian forces operating further westwards. Until the Russians gain control over Hulyai, the essence of their supplies, the main portion comes from the eastern flank along the second line of defense itself. Therefore, aligning the front line with the Vovcha river line in the north, all throughout the river line to the western direction, secures the supply lines for the offensive operations further westwards. There is a connection from the first line of defense up towards the second line of defense. However, if they lose the second line of defense, then the Ukrainians can counterattack further to cut off the first line of defense as well and continue advancing southwards. This is why the capture of the Yanchur river line was so important, because it allows for another defensive line and supply line further south. But again, if they lose the first and second lines of defense, then the Ukrainians can attack further southwards with the defensive positions and fortifications to their back. That is why the Russians are looking for the best defensible position in the northern flank, which is the river line as a natural barrier. However, the Ukrainian positions on the northern bank of the Vovcha river line are centered around the forest patches and the town of Velikomukailivka. What this means is that the Ukrainians are able to move between the town itself and the forest patches and cross over to the southern bank of the Vovcha river line from these forest patches towards the settlements in small infantry groups. This is what allowed them to re-enter the town of Novoselivka and Oleksandrorad by pushing alongside the forest patches across the river line and over to these settlements. Now that the Russians have re-secured the positions, they're able to counter those incursions and regain control over the river line. Establishing positions within these settlements and keeping a garrison within them prevents the Ukrainians from capturing them with small infantry groups and needs larger grouping of forces. This means the Russians are here looking to consolidate the positions and group up with stronger forces before securing their flank and preventing another Ukrainian counterattack in the area. The recapture of portions of Sosnivka, which the Ukrainians attempted as well, was as a result of a mechanized attack where the Ukrainians pushed towards the settlement. However, with the recent recapture of the settlement and the capture for the Stopil, that has been limited as well. The Ukrainian crossing of armored vehicles across the Vovcha river line is difficult now that the Russians have control over the river line itself. Therefore, in conclusion, the Russian positions and northern flank has been fully secured along the Vovcha river line with the recent advances. However, the Ukrainians still have the foothold along Oleksandrorad in the east and Tychy in the west along the Vovcha river line. All of this allows the Russians to continue their offensive operations in the western direction. The recapture of the fortifications here to the south of the Vovcha river line near Velikomukailivka allows them to secure the road connecting Novoselivka to Orestopil, and in the western direction, the advances along the forest lines and forest patches is an attempt to gain control over Tychy and advance towards the Vovcha river line, and the capture of Hai in the north and the fortifications in the south is a push further in the western direction towards Veteratne, which allowed them to gain control over a wider section of the highway area and connect with their forces between Danilivka in the south to the forces in the north as they advance on both banks of the river line, not to mention the fact that the road connects from Melinivka in the south up through Poltavka through the first line of defense and all the way up towards Danilivka. This means the Russians will have an additional supply line to the second line of defense. With the capture of the fortifications and settlements on the western bank of the Yanchur River, they still need to close the forest line positions of the Ukrainians along Rybne and Solotki before fully securing the road. but with control over the road to be able to resupply the forces all the way up to Danilivka from the southern road and eastern road, where they can bypass Huliaipole completely by advancing on the northern bank of the riverline here to the southwest of Rivnopilya, by gaining control over those lakes here within the first patch area and the fortifications in the area. The Russians will be able to secure the southern flank and concentrate their forces towards the highway, where they can advance on the northern bank of the Enchir River along the second line of defense to gain control over the fortifications, and alongside it on the eastern flank of the fortifications and the river line to advance to gain control over the settlements. To gain full control over the settlements will allow them to gain control over the highway, allowing them to better connect their forces between the north and the south. Gaining full control over the highway and the second line of defense in the northwestern flank of Huliaipole will allow them to start pressuring Huliaipole itself from the northern and eastern directions. To the northeast of this, the Russians continue offensive operations in the direction of Konstantinivka, where they managed to gain control over additional fortifications on the northern flank and eastern flank of the settlement. Storming it from this direction allowed them to gain control of additional parts of the highway between Konstantinivka and Ivanopilya, as they're slowly closing in on gaining full control over the settlement by gaining control over everything east of the river line and advancing towards the river line, with the river line to the Ukrainian backs, which forces them to withdraw across a river line rather than through roads that are well connected, and limits the supplies to the forces operating within the town. Russians are slowly pushing through from the southern, eastern, and now also northern directions to gain control over the town, which will allow them to have residential areas to go through towards the city from the south, especially now that we are in the second half of November. Most trees have all of their leaves fallen off, which means that they do not provide much cover against drones any longer, and with the winter period and the colder weather, thermal scopes work much better, which has an easier time detecting Russian forces. Therefore, drones will be much more effective in these forest line areas. However, if the Russians are able to consolidate their positions within their residential areas, they'll be able to make use of those as cover instead. To the north of this, the Russians started storming the town of Siversk from the south. They started storming the fortifications on the southern outskirts and gained a foothold within the southern residential area, gaining control over the southernmost street with the Sqkm river to the south. And this is a very interesting development because I did not expect the Russians to push into the town despite the difficulty of supplies going all the way up. As I just mentioned, the leaves are starting to completely fall off, meaning the forest lines do not provide that much cover any longer. But this could also be why they hastened to push up towards the town to have the cover from the settlement itself. In either case, the Russians have now started storming Siversk itself. Gaining the foothold is the first step, and now fighting will take place over the fortifications on the southern flank and on the eastern flank to gain full control over those and gain full control over the town subsequently. To the northwest of this, the Russians have cut off the highway leading in from the Liman direction by gaining control over Platonivka here to the south of Tronivka. Following the capture of Tronivka, the Russians pushed through to gain control over the fortifications and are contesting the second fortification to the south of Tronivka along the railway that connects up towards Siversk itself, and have advanced along the first lines towards Platonivka in the southern direction from the town, which allowed them to gain full control over it, and with that a firing position on the highway towards Siversk, connecting Siversk and Liman. This push allowed the Russians to increase the pressure on the Ukrainian positions along the highway to the west, and will also allow the Russians to flank the fortifications of the Ukrainians in the western flank of Siversk. Siversk itself is located on the low ground. You can typically tell by the river lines because the river lines always go through the low ground, and on both banks of the river is the high ground. Now, Siversk itself goes through the low ground. The town itself is in the low ground, while the western heights overlooks the settlement itself, where the Ukrainians are able to defend Siversk by holding these fortifications on the western bank of the river line. If the Russians are able to gain control over these fortifications by flanking them from the rear and pushing through them, then the capture of Siversk becomes much more simple. It also overlooks the highway leading into Siversk. The final highway that supplies Siversk is the one here to the south, going through Sviatopokrovsk. The Russians storming Siversk without gaining control over Svanivka and cutting off the highway to the northwest indicates that the Ukrainian positions and garrison there may be too powerful for the Russians to push through with their limited resources that are able to reach the front line, and they need more artillery and drone preparation on these positions as well as airstrikes to prepare before they attack the positions. The Russians may also look to bypass Siversk itself by attacking the fortifications from the northern direction, especially with the push from Platonivka, which leaves no settlements between the Russian positions and the Ukrainian fortifications, overlooking the southern highway, which means the Russians can push through the fortifications and gain fire control over the highway, completely encircling Siversk from any and all supplies. To the north of the Usk river line along the border area, the Russians continue offensive operations, gaining control over the town of Zaporizhzhia. With the capture of Zaporizhzhia, the Russians continue offensive operations along the border area on the western bank of the Usk river line, where they're now connecting both sides of the operations across the Usk river line from Kamyanka in the east to the border crossing in the north. The Russian forces on this section of the front line continue to develop their offensive operations to threaten the next defensive line of the Ukrainians along the settlements from Obukhivka in the north to Petroivanivka in the south. As for the Vovchansk direction, the Russians continue offensive operations through the central parts in the southern section of the town, where they managed to gain control over additional roads connecting to the northern bank of the Vovchansk river line, and alongside the residential area, gain control over the southern outskirts and central parts of the town, as they're pushing the Ukrainians into the eastern outskirts of it, where they continued offensive operations to kick the Ukraine out in the eastern direction to gain control over additional crossings across the Vovchansk river line to strengthen the logistics to their forces in the southern bank of the Vovchansk river line and within Vovchansk itself, and continue offensive operations to strengthen the logistical situation and supply situation for the forces within the town itself, and to weaken the Ukrainian positions within it by pushing them out of the better fortified areas. The Ukrainians do not have any additional apartment complex buildings or similar areas where they can take cover from Russian drone fire, which means that the Russians are mainly advancing with the use of infantry and drones through the southern parts of Vovchansk, where they are striking any Ukrainian positions they detect with the drones, allowing them to clear the buildings without having to fight directly with the Ukrainian forces, allowing for a slow but steady advance with little to no casualties except for the Ukrainian counter-drone warfare, which is limited by the lack of supply lines heading into Vovchansk for the Ukrainians now that the Russians have gained control over the southern outskirts, which cuts off all of the main supply lines leading into Vovchansk for the Ukrainians. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.